Welcome back to History in Ashes, where we sift quietly through the dust of long-forgotten centuries. Today, we begin with a strange and unsettling truth from the ancient world. Entire cities vanished across the Mediterranean in a span of only a few decades. Coastal kingdoms that once thrived on trade, diplomacy, and careful bureaucracy were suddenly reduced to silent layers of ash. And scattered across ancient inscriptions is the faint echo of an unnamed force, a loose coalition of wandering peoples, recorded only as those who came from the sea. The scribes who wrote nearly everything else with clinical precision seemed unable to fully explain who these intruders were or where they had come from, yet they blamed them for catastrophes that reshaped an entire age. It is a chilling thought. Civilizations that had stood for centuries, supported by complex networks of copper and tin exchanges, palace economies, trained scribes, and organized armies, simply crumpled when faced with these unknown invaders. Not slowly, not through a gentle decline, but abruptly like a rope suddenly cut. Archaeologists today walk through ruins where storerooms remain darkened by ancient fire, where the last meals still lie carbonized inside clay pots, untouched for more than 3,000 years. And in many of these burned layers, no written explanation survives. Just smoke, silence, and debris, with the final clue in Egyptian accounts that describe foreign ships arriving with warriors, families, ox carts, and entire communities moving across the sea. Before we go any further into this strange collapse, may I ask you gently and politely to scroll down to the comments and let us know where you are watching from and what time it is there. It helps us imagine how far across the world these old stories travel. And if you have not yet subscribed to History in Ashes, I would ask in the same spirit as the desperate Bronze Age kings to lend us your support. Unlike those ancient rulers, we promise not to invade your coastline, only your recommendation feed. Without your subscription, this channel might fade into the digital equivalent of a burned coastal ruin, and none of us want to study that in the future. Now, let us return to the story. The first records that ever mention these mysterious groups come from Egyptian inscriptions carved near the end of the Late Bronze Age. In those carvings, the scribes describe an alliance of foreign peoples, arriving by both land and sea. The Egyptians referred to each group with distinct names, but modern historians tend to gather them under a single label, the Sea Peoples. These inscriptions are not poetic exaggerations. They are administrative records, straightforward and almost bored in tone, listing the materials used in battles, the provisions gathered, and the leaders involved. Yet, unexpectedly, they also recount one of the most bewildering mass movements in ancient history. The Egyptians wrote that these groups came from the midst of the sea. The phrase is frustratingly vague. To scholars, it implies families uprooted by a mixture of environmental stress, political instability, or perhaps the collapse of their own homelands. To the Egyptians, it meant chaos at the edge of their world. The Mediterranean, which had long served as a thoroughfare for merchants and royal envoys, turned into a highway for displaced warriors carrying unfamiliar weapons. At the same time, inland routes that once linked Anatolia, the Levant, and Egypt became clogged with refugees, raiders, and migrants seeking new land, food, or safety. It was a multi-layered disaster, with no single cause, a storm of interconnected failures. Many modern explanations involve climate change during the Late Bronze Age. Evidence from tree rings, pollen studies, and lake sediments suggests prolonged drought that may have lasted for decades. Harvest failures likely led to famine. Palace economies, which depended on predictable grain surpluses and steady trade networks, would have struggled to function in such conditions. The great kingdoms had become so dependent on long-distance trade for metals that even minor disruptions could destabilize them. Copper from Cyprus, tin possibly from as far as Central Asia, timber from Lebanon, silver from Anatolia. All of these materials moved in a delicate circuit that kept weapons, tools, luxury goods, and political alliances alive. When this circuit began to fail, cities that once thrived on careful record-keeping and stable exchange found themselves exposed. The fall of one kingdom rippled into the next, creating a chain reaction of weakness that no single ruler could fully contain. Some people fled, others turned to raiding. Maritime communities, long experienced with boats and coastal life, may have simply expanded their radius of movement, encountering other groups with similar pressures. Suddenly, the Mediterranean was full of displaced peoples, each trying to secure food, land, or new places to settle. This backdrop of instability is essential to understanding why the Sea Peoples appeared so threatening in ancient records. They did not seem to be a single empire or tribe, but rather a moving collection of groups, each with its own reasons for taking to the sea. Some carried their families and belongings in ox carts, which Egyptian carvings depict with surprising detail. Others travelled by ships designed for swift coastal raids. Their arrival was not a neat invasion, but a symptom of a much larger regional crisis. In the archaeological layers of cities like Ugarit, we find the remains of hurried letters written during the final days of the kingdom. One of these clay tablets, preserved by the fire that destroyed the city, contains a desperate message from a local official asking for urgent reinforcements. He reports that enemy ships had been sighted along the coast. Yet when the letter arrived, it was already too late. Ugarit burned not long after, and its last archives were sealed in destroyed buildings for millennia. The officials who wrote those letters likely died within days. Another striking piece of evidence comes from the island of Cyprus, where once flourishing urban centres show clear signs of abrupt destruction. In some sites, entire neighbourhoods were abandoned without rebuilding. The fine pottery, jewellery moulds, and administrative tools common in earlier centuries vanish from the record. Instead, we see simpler household materials used by people trying to survive rather than thrive. This shift tells us not only that societies were collapsing, but also that the survivors were adapting, rearranging their ways of life to face new constraints. The Sea Peoples appear in these events not always as aggressors, but sometimes as participants in a broader movement. Some groups tried to settle on foreign shores, perhaps driven by hunger or displacement. Others joined existing conflicts, aligning with local factions seeking advantage in a chaotic era. Their role was intertwined with the collapse, both a cause and a consequence of it. Egypt, with its strong bureaucracy and irrigation-based agriculture, resisted the chaos longer than many neighbors. But even Egypt felt the pressure. Pharaohs described battles fought simultaneously on the Nile Delta, the open sea, and inland routes. What makes these accounts significant is their administrative detail. They list supplies gathered, strategies used, and the numbers of prisoners taken. These were not mythic tales but operational reports, written by scribes whose job was to keep the machinery of the state running even as the world around them faltered. One inscription describes how the pharaoh prepared defensive positions along the Nile Delta, creating a barrier for both land-based migrants and seaborne raiders. Another records the capture of entire families among the foreign groups, confirming that these were not isolated bands of warriors, but migrating populations. Egypt's victory in these engagements did not end the regional crisis. It only prevented Egypt itself from collapsing. What makes this era especially fascinating is how little is known about the identities of the Sea Peoples. Some may have originated in the Aegean, others from Anatolia, and others still from regions farther west. Their names appear in Egyptian records: the Shurden, the Peliset, the Shekelesh, the Luka, and others, but most cannot be linked with certainty to specific later peoples. The lack of clear origins adds to their mystery and to the difficulty of reconstructing their role in the Bronze Age collapse. Archaeology provides fragments. Weapon types found in destroyed sites often match styles from distant regions, suggesting mixing of cultural elements. Pottery traditions show sudden changes, reflecting new inhabitants or shifting trade networks. Burial practices shift. Settlement patterns reorganize. Every layer hints at movement, conflict, and adaptation, yet the puzzle remains incomplete. Each discovery opens new questions. Were the Sea Peoples merely migrants whose movements coincided with a broader collapse? Were they opportunistic raiders exploiting a weakened world? Or were they themselves driven by disasters that forced them into desperate journeys? As we begin this long exploration of the Mediterranean's forgotten crisis, one question lingers quietly. In a world so interconnected and fragile, how many small failures does it take before everything begins to fall apart? The echoes of those first chaotic appearances ripple outward, leading us into the deeper, slower transformations that had already begun long before anyone carved the words, "those who came from the sea." To understand why the world was so vulnerable when these wandering groups appeared, We have to look at the quiet, decades-long unraveling that was already reshaping the Mediterranean. It did not start with fire or invasion. It started with the gradual weakening of a system that had once seemed permanent. The Late Bronze Age was built on cooperation between distant kingdoms. This cooperation did not come from idealism or shared culture. It emerged from necessity. Copper, which formed the backbone of tools and weapons, was located in one region. Tin, the element that transformed copper into bronze, was located in others. Timber for shipbuilding came from the mountains of the Levant. Luxury materials such as amber, lapis lazuli, and ivory moved along long-distance routes maintained by diplomats and merchants who carried not only goods, but also news, letters, and political expectations. Every kingdom depended on others in a way that made peace not a virtue but a requirement. This network functioned like a delicate circulatory system. When one artery narrowed or closed, others suffered. A drought in one region could cause a spike in grain prices in another. A rebellion in a small mountain territory might interrupt a tin route, forcing a palace to postpone its bronze shipments. Even these minor disturbances could accumulate, stressing the system until the smallest shock produced disproportionate consequences. One example, often overlooked in broader histories, is how important written correspondence had become. Kings exchanged letters that read almost like business memos, discussing shipments, taxes, marriage alliances, and even complaints about broken promises. The famous archive from Amarna, buried beneath centuries of dust in Egypt, contains hundreds of these clay tablets. They show kings relying on one another for resources they could not obtain themselves. They also reveal a world filled with anxieties, requests for grain, warnings about hostile neighbors, and constant reminders of treaties that needed to be honored. This dependence on written records, stored in palace archives, meant that state administration relied heavily on scribes. The scribes themselves depended on a steady supply of clay tablets, writing tools, and training centers. All of this required stability. So when instability crept in, even the intellectual infrastructure of these kingdoms faltered. Training new scribes became difficult. Archives were abandoned or destroyed. Knowledge that had once passed seamlessly from one generation to the next suddenly faced interruptions. Archaeologists can trace these disruptions in surprising detail. In some regions, the style of writing becomes simplified, indicating that scribes were working under pressure or without the luxury of long apprenticeships. In others, the number of documents drops sharply, suggesting that palace centers were losing their administrative capacity even before their final destruction. These may seem like the dullest details imaginable, the thickness of a clay tablet, the angle of a stylus stroke, but they reveal the nervous system of an ancient world on the edge of exhaustion. At the same time, climate evidence points to prolonged drought affecting agriculture. When rainfall diminished, harvest yields declined. Farmers who once produced enough grain to feed themselves, their local authority, and the palace found themselves struggling. This strain worked its way upward. Local officials received fewer taxes in grain. Palaces could no longer feed large workforces. Armies could not be provisioned. Bureaucrats, unable to distribute resources as before, had to make difficult decisions. Sometimes they cut wages. Sometimes they demanded more from already strained villages. Both actions made local unrest more likely. Across the Mediterranean, settlements that had thrived for generations began to shrink. Some show signs of hurried fortification, as if communities expected raids or unrest. Others were simply abandoned. These were not dramatic, overnight evacuations. They were slow, bleeding losses, where families quietly left to seek more stable land, one household at a time. Over decades, these small, local decisions reshaped the demographic map of entire regions. Trade ships that once moved steadily between ports began to sail less frequently. Bakers in palace kitchens lacked imported ingredients. Armorers could not access enough copper or tin. The effects of this decline were cumulative. Each failing component weakened another. A palace that could no longer produce bronze weapons might lose its military advantage. A kingdom unable to feed its workers might lose its ability to maintain irrigation canals. And once irrigation systems failed, farms suffered even more. The weakening of these systems created opportunities for groups on the margins. including coastal raiders and displaced communities, to push into territories that had once been too well defended or too well organized for such incursions to succeed. The Sea Peoples did not cause the collapse alone. They entered a world already cracking at the seams. If we move north into Anatolia, we encounter the Hittite Empire, a powerful and highly organized state that had dominated the region for centuries. By the time the Sea Peoples appear in historical records, the Hittite archives indicate a kingdom strained by internal conflict, rebellious vassals, and shortages of grain. Letters from Hittite kings urgently request shipments of food from their allies, describing famine conditions severe enough to threaten the stability of the empire. In one surviving letter, the king writes with almost painful desperation, asking for relief shipments because his people will die of hunger. When an empire begins to starve, its borders soften. Armies grow smaller or weaker. Garrisons go unpaid. Local rulers become tempted to break away. This creates openings for migrating groups or raiders to seize land or resources. The Hittites fought hard to maintain their dominance, but the combination of famine, rebellion, and external pressure proved too much. Their capital, Hattusa, was eventually abandoned, its once mighty gates left to crumble under centuries of neglect. Further south, along the Levantine coast, cities that once controlled some of the most important maritime trade routes faced similar challenges. When the port of Byblos struggled with declining timber shipments, its influence waned. When Ugarit began to experience shortages, its diplomatic correspondence grew increasingly anxious. The famous letter from the last king of Ugarit, pleading for reinforcements, is not an isolated message. It is part of a growing trend of desperation in the decades leading up to the city's fall. On Cyprus, evidence suggests a period of social disruption even before the major destructions linked to the Sea Peoples. Several settlements show signs of internal conflict, with weapons found inside domestic areas and hasty defenses erected around neighborhoods that had previously been open. This suggests local unrest or power struggles, possibly connected to collapsing trade networks or shifting alliances. In the Aegean region, the Mycenaean kingdoms faced their own troubles. These were societies built around palatial centers where elites controlled trade, agriculture, and labor. When trade routes faltered, these palaces could not maintain their elaborate redistributive systems. The famous Linear B tablets found in Mycenaean palaces show extensive record-keeping about livestock, land, offerings to gods, and worker assignments. Yet in the final decades before their collapse, these tablets hint at shortages, increased bureaucracy, and emergency measures. The Mycenaean world did not collapse uniformly. Some palaces burned while others survived for decades longer. Some regions recovered quickly while others fell permanently into ruin. This uneven pattern indicates that the collapse was not caused by a single event, but by interconnected failures spreading unevenly across the Mediterranean. And so, when the Sea Peoples arrived in loose coalitions, carrying their families and weapons, they entered a world already destabilized. Their movements accelerated the collapse, but they were also shaped by it. They were not outsiders invading a stable world. They were part of a much larger tapestry of displacement and change. This raises a deeper question about the Late Bronze Age. When systems become so interconnected and so dependent on one another, does collapse become inevitable when too many strands begin to fray at once? As the Mediterranean's fragile networks continued to fray, the internal pressures within the great kingdoms deepened. It is tempting, when reading a sweeping history of collapse, to imagine external invasions as the chief cause, but the truth is far plainer and far more unsettling. Many of the ancient states were already eroding from within, long before any unknown ships appeared on their horizons. The Sea Peoples arrived at a moment when the internal machinery of these kingdoms was grinding itself toward exhaustion. The transitional decades of the Late Bronze Age were marked not by dramatic battles or sudden disasters, but by a slow accumulation of small, administrative failures. These failures were rarely recorded directly. No scribe carved a tablet announcing that the state was weakening. Instead, the decline appears in the margins, in reduced taxation records, inconsistent weights found in commercial centers, and pottery deposits that suggest shrinking households. These quiet details reveal a world where palace authority no longer reached as far or as confidently as before. One of the least glamorous but most important signs of internal strain was the shortage of skilled labor. In a world built around palaces, many professions were centralized. Metalworkers, carpenters, potters, textile producers, and scribes often depended on palace oversight and ration distribution. When food shortages began to affect palatial centers, these workers either received reduced rations or lost their positions altogether. Skilled laborers, who once worked exclusively for the palace, might have turned to local markets or village communities to survive. Over time, this eroded the palace's control over production and weakened the once reliable flow of goods and services. Even more revealing is the changing political landscape. Vassal states, which had previously sent tribute to larger empires, began asserting their independence. In some regions, these local rulers withheld grain shipments or military support, either because they were unable to fulfill their obligations or because they sensed opportunity in the weakening authority of their overlords. This created a cascade of instability. When one vassal defected, others sometimes followed, seeking to avoid being the only loyal state burdened by obligations that no longer brought sufficient protection. The Hittite Empire offers a clear example of this process. In earlier centuries, the Hittites commanded a vast network of vassal states and allied territories, but as drought and famine spread, these relationships became strained. Letters from the Hittite court show repeated attempts to reinforce loyalty among their subjects, often by invoking past alliances or promising future rewards. Yet even these appeals reveal a certain anxiety, a recognition that alliances which once seemed solid had become fragile. In some letters, Hittite officials accuse their vassals of withholding resources or cooperating with enemies. These accusations hint at deeper fractures in the political fabric of the empire. In the Mycenaean world, internal struggles also intensified. The palace at Pylos, one of the best documented Mycenaean centers, shows signs of heightened military activity in its final years. Linear B tablets from this palace list unusually large amounts of bronze being allocated for weapons rather than tools. There are also records suggesting emergency recruitment of soldiers from outlying areas. These signs of militarization imply that the palace was preparing for threats, possibly from rival Mycenaean states or from internal rebellions. But the very need for such measures indicates deepening instability. At Knossos, on the island of Crete, the administrative system had already declined significantly before the final destruction of many Mycenaean palaces. Earlier Minoan traditions had faded, replaced by Mycenaean structures that eventually struggled to maintain their own authority. The island's earlier prosperity, once driven by vibrant maritime trade, had dwindled as trade routes grew less predictable. Without steady imports and exports, local elites lost the wealth and influence that had sustained them. If we move east to the Levant, similar patterns emerge. Cities like Hazor, Megiddo, and Lachish were all heavily fortified, suggesting that danger, whether external or internal, was a constant presence. Some fortifications were rebuilt multiple times over a relatively short period, indicating either repeated attacks or chronic fear of them. Excavations reveal signs of elite turnover, with older administrative buildings replaced by new ones that sometimes lack the same level of architectural sophistication. These shifts suggest that established ruling families may have been replaced by new elites seeking to assert control during a period of uncertainty. Another component of internal decline was the growing inequality within these societies. Palace economies tended to concentrate wealth at the top, redistributing only enough resources to maintain loyalty among officials and workers. When shortages intensified, the palace often preserved its own stores and reduced the provisions allotted to lower-ranking workers and farmers. This widened the gap between elites and common people, creating resentment and sometimes outright rebellion. Archaeologists have found signs of violent destruction within elite districts in some cities, where buildings were burned and goods looted, possibly by local populations rising against their rulers. These internal fractures were further exacerbated by migration pressures from the margins of the Mediterranean world. As drought and instability spread, communities living in less fertile regions were sometimes forced to move in search of land and resources. These movements were not always hostile. Many groups likely sought peaceful integration into existing settlements, but their arrival strained already weakened systems, creating competition for food, jobs, and land. In some cases, local populations may have perceived migrants as threats, leading to conflict that destabilized the region further. One often overlooked detail is the role of disease during periods of collapse. Although written records rarely mention epidemics directly, some archaeological layers show sudden drops in population that cannot be fully explained by warfare or migration alone. In densely populated palace centers, where workers lived in close quarters and sanitation was limited, disease could spread rapidly. A weakened population, suffering from hunger and potentially disease, struggled to maintain the complex systems that had once supported their civilization. With all these pressures converging, famine, internal rebellion, declining trade, loss of skilled labor, disease, and political fragmentation, the great kingdoms of the Mediterranean were already weakened before the sea peoples appeared in large numbers. The internal struggles of these kingdoms acted like dry tinder, waiting for a spark, and the spark came in many forms. Some migrating groups arrived, seeking new homes, others engaged in raiding. Some aligned with discontented locals. Some were absorbed into existing societies. The Sea Peoples were not a single invading force, but part of a much larger movement of populations shaped by internal and external crises. The final centuries of the Late Bronze Age remind us that collapse is rarely caused by a single dramatic event. More often, it is a quiet, cumulative process that unfolds slowly, almost imperceptibly, until a tipping point is reached and long-standing institutions fall apart. And it makes us ask a deeper, lingering question. If the ancient kingdoms had recognized the signs of internal decay earlier, could they have prevented the cascade of failures that followed, or were their systems already too rigid to adapt? The internal fracturing of the Mediterranean kingdoms sets the stage for one of the most haunting patterns in the archaeological landscape: the slow, uneven waves of coastal destruction and abandonment that marked the end of the Late Bronze Age. These events were not uniform. Some cities burned fiercely and left clear evidence of violent attack. Others were quietly deserted, their streets left to winds and drifting soil. Together, these ruins form a kind of fragmented map of a world in transition, a world in which people along the coasts found themselves caught between the collapse of their own political systems and the arrival of new, displaced populations. If the inland palaces had been the administrative heart of the Bronze Age, the coastal settlements had been its lifeblood. These were the places where merchants docked, where diplomats traveled, where carpenters built ships, where scribes recorded trade inventories on clay tablets, and where the sounds of foreign languages blended into the daily bustle of markets. When these cities began to suffer, the entire interconnected world felt the impact. One of the earliest cities to show signs of severe damage was Ugarit, a wealthy port nestled on the northeastern edge of the Mediterranean. The city had thrived for centuries, its rulers balancing diplomacy with the Hittites, the Egyptians, and various Levantine powers. Ugarit's archives, preserved by fire, reveal a sophisticated society with a thriving merchant class, shipbuilders, and international correspondence. Yet as the pressures of drought, disrupted trade, and internal political stress accumulated, Ugarit's position became perilous. The famous final letters discovered in the ruins are striking for their immediacy. One message pleads for military assistance, warning of enemy ships approaching the coast. Another complains that the sender's grain shipments have been delayed, suggesting that even routine logistics were faltering. These letters arrived too late. The city was destroyed swiftly, and its palace, scribal quarter, and storage rooms were sealed beneath layers of ash and rubble. No rebuilding followed. The silence of the city after its fall is one of the clearest markers of how thoroughly the Bronze Age system had unraveled. Southward along the coastline, other settlements suffered similar fates. At Megiddo, archaeologists discovered destruction layers dating to the same turbulent period. The city's fortifications appear hastily repaired, and portions of the city show evidence of burning. Yet the pattern here is more complicated. Some areas were rebuilt after the destruction, indicating that even in moments of crisis, pockets of stability persisted. But the reconstructed city never regained its earlier scale or grandeur. The palace architecture became simpler, storage areas smaller, and administrative buildings less elaborate. This represents not merely the aftermath of a violent event, but a transformation in the city's social and economic structure. Farther south, at Ashkelon and other Philistine coastal sites, The destruction layers are followed by a striking shift in material culture. Pottery styles change, reflecting influences from the Aegean world. Houses adopt new layouts. Food remains suggest different dietary patterns. These changes have led many scholars to associate these sites with groups among the Sea Peoples, particularly those labeled the Peliset in Egyptian records. Whether these new populations arrived violently or gradually remains debated, but the material evidence points to cultural mixing, adaptation, and the establishment of new communities in the wake of earlier destruction. It is important to stress that not all coastal collapses can be attributed directly to outside attack. Some sites show clear evidence of burning and smashed weapons, but others contain subtle clues of internal upheaval. At certain locations, storerooms were left full of unused goods, suggesting that the inhabitants fled suddenly rather than perished in battle. In other places, valuables were carefully removed before abandonment, implying that the population left intentionally, perhaps relocating inland or to safer regions. On Cyprus, the picture is especially complex. The island had been a major producer of copper, supplying much of the Mediterranean. Its cities, including Enkomi and Kishon, show signs of both destruction and rebuilding. Some layers reveal widespread burning, while others show new architectural styles emerging shortly afterward. One particularly intriguing detail is the shift in burial practices. Earlier traditions disappear, replaced by new customs that may reflect the arrival or assimilation of different groups. Here again, the story is not simply one of violent invasion, but of long-term transformation, shaped by migration, economic disruption, and the decline of palatial authority. Even inland regions were affected by these coastal changes. When ports collapsed, the flow of goods inland slowed or halted. Caravans that once carried copper, tin, or grain from one kingdom to another no longer arrived reliably. Merchants who depended on stable trade routes found themselves without markets. Artisans skilled in producing luxury goods lost access to materials such as ivory or precious stones. This economic contraction weakened the inland palaces even further, contributing to the larger collapse that had begun decades earlier. In Greece, the Mycenaean palaces also suffered a series of catastrophic events during this period. The destruction layers at Pylos are particularly telling. The palace was burned violently, its storerooms filled with charred remains of written tablets, jars of oil, and military equipment. Some rooms contain the remnants of hastily abandoned tasks, half-finished pots, discarded tools, or styluses dropped near clay tablets. The Linear B records from Pylos in its final days mention watch stations along the coast, indicating that the palace was aware of threats approaching from the sea. Whether these threats were the Sea Peoples, rival Mycenaean forces, or internal rebels remains uncertain. Mycenae, Tiryns, and Thebes also experienced destruction events, though the timelines and causes differ. In some cities, rebuilding efforts followed, but these reconstructions were simpler, less monumental, and less centralized. Palatial authority was fading, replaced by smaller regional powers or local leaders who governed more modest settlements. The once mighty Mycenaean world splintered into smaller factions, each adapting to new economic and political conditions. In the Levant, the collapse of coastal cities had another significant consequence. It altered the balance of power inland. Smaller city-states gained temporary autonomy as larger powers weakened. New groups, such as the early Israelites in the Central Highlands, began forming distinct communities that would later shape the region's history. These highland settlements show no signs of destruction or invasion during this period. Instead, they contain simple architecture, modest pottery, and evidence of small-scale farming, suggesting that some populations avoided the chaos entirely by living in areas less affected by the collapse of the coastal economies. This shift in population distribution reminds us that collapse is not uniform. Where one region experiences fire and abandonment, another undergoes gradual growth or quiet survival. Where one society disintegrates, another emerges with different cultural practices and political structures. Throughout the Mediterranean, the pattern is unmistakable. Coastal cities, once the hubs of trade and communication, suffered disproportionately during the late Bronze Age collapse. Their downfall was not caused by a single group or a single event, but by a convergence of local failures, external pressures, and the deep interconnectedness that had once been their strength. The Sea Peoples appear in this narrative as both participants in and products of the larger crisis. Their arrival in coastal regions accelerated the decline in some cases and facilitated new settlements in others. But they did not act in a vacuum. They were part of a vast web of migrations, economic contractions, political upheavals, and environmental stresses that reshaped the entire Mediterranean. As we step back and look at the broader picture, the ruins of these coastal cities raise a quiet, lingering question. When a society builds its identity around the sea, what happens when the very roots that once brought prosperity begin instead to carry the seeds of its undoing? A quiet transition is perhaps the only appropriate way to return to the looping uncertainties of the Late Bronze Age, because nothing in this period shifts in a straight line. Everything bends, folds, and collapses at odd angles. So as we pick up the story again, we find ourselves standing in the shadow of disappearing kingdoms, watching once stable systems unravel, not with a single catastrophic blow, but with a series of exhausting stumbles that left everyone vulnerable. It is within this vulnerability that the Sea Peoples gain momentum, because history rarely grants power to those who are already strong. It grants power to those who know how to slip into the empty spaces left behind. One of those empty spaces stretched across the Aegean world. The Mycenaean palaces, sprawling complexes of administrative rooms, storage magazines, and decorated halls, had once hummed like predictable machines. They were not simply royal residences, they were nerve centers that regulated grain distribution, textile production, trade partnerships, and diplomatic etiquette. Their scribes recorded everything from oil rations for laborers to shipments of bronze ingots. But by the closing decades of the 13th century before the Common Era, those records cease abruptly. A palace economy, no matter how advanced, collapses the moment its administrative chain breaks, and that chain snapped in several places at once. Archaeologists studying the burned layers at Tiryns, Mycenae, and Pylos noticed something striking. The destruction was intense, but the recovery was either slow or non-existent. In some places, rebuilding efforts were modest and short-lived. In others, people abandoned the ruins altogether. This pattern hints at a profound exhaustion among the survivors, an exhaustion that suggests these cities were not merely hit by a single wave of violence, but were already weakened by years of internal strain. When new threats appeared, they simply could not absorb them. The question, of course, is what those threats were. Various clues point to a mixture of factors: shifting trade routes, dwindling supplies of tin, unpredictable harvests, and increased pressure from groups on the move. It is in this chaotic network of disruptions that the appearance of the Sea Peoples becomes both more believable and more unsettling. Their movements were not detached from broader instability. They were shaped by it. And the Mediterranean, once a corridor of stable commercial relationships, suddenly transformed into a space contested by people with very little to lose. Travel further east, and a similar story plays out along the coastlines of the Levant. Cities that had been essential nodes in the trade system, Ugarit in particular, began sending out distressed letters. One of the most haunting tablets found in the archives of Ugarit is a plea from its last king, Amurapi. He wrote to a neighboring ruler that enemy ships had appeared off his coast and that he had no forces left to defend the city because his troops were away on other assignments. The phrasing is desperate, almost resigned, and while we cannot hear the tone in which it was originally written, we can sense the despair between the lines. This was not a proud monarch preparing for a decisive victory. This was a leader who already understood that help would not arrive in time. Ugarit's final destruction layer was thick, containing collapsed walls, charred beams, and household goods left behind in mid-use, as though families fled in minutes. But what is equally striking is what comes after. Nothing. The site was never rebuilt. A city that had once orchestrated trade between Cyprus, Anatolia, Egypt, and the interior of the Near East fell silent. Its port, once busy with incoming and outgoing vessels, sat empty under the sun. This silence invites the unsettling possibility that the Sea Peoples, if they were indeed responsible for Ugarit's fall, understood perfectly well what they were doing. They were not aimlessly burning coastlines. They were severing the connective tissue of the Late Bronze Age world, removing the intermediaries, the storehouses, and the bureaucratic centers that kept the flow of wealth stable. When those nodes disappeared, everything downstream collapsed with them. But the sea peoples themselves remained elusive. We glimpse them only through the perceptions of others. Egyptian artists depicting compact formations of warriors in horned helmets, Hittite scribes naming them with annoyance or fear, and smaller states describing them as raiders, migrants, or burdens. This absence of self-representation leaves an uncomfortable void because it forces us to view them through the anxieties of the societies they threatened. Their true motivations, alliances, and internal structures remain obscured. Still, there are clues. In several archaeological sites, once associated with their movements, particularly in Cyprus, stratigraphic layers reveal shifts in pottery styles, domestic architecture, and burial customs. These changes suggest that the sea peoples were not simply passing through. In some places, they stayed long enough to influence or displace local populations. The presence of locally copied versions of foreign pottery forms indicates prolonged interaction, not momentary violence. This raises an interesting possibility. Some groups that we categorize under the broad label Sea Peoples may not have begun as maritime raiders at all. They may have been displaced villagers from inland regions, people who took to the sea out of necessity rather than preference. When inland trade systems faltered, when fields yielded less grain, or when rival powers expanded aggressively, entire communities may have found themselves with no realistic path forward except mobility. Mobility, in times of crisis, is a form of survival, but survival is rarely simple, and it becomes even more complex when multiple groups are forced into the same shrinking spaces. Imagine the narrow corridors of eastern Mediterranean trade routes, ships full of grain from Egypt, copper from Cyprus, luxury goods from Crete, and timber from the Levant. Now imagine those same corridors crowded with refugee groups, armed bands searching for food, displaced families hoping for new settlement land, and opportunistic warlords exploiting the confusion. The Sea Peoples, whoever they fully were, likely contained a mixture of all these categories. When the Egyptian reliefs list names such as the Shurdan, the Shekelesh, the Danuna, the Peliset, and others, they may not be identifying unified tribes. They may be naming coalitions of people temporarily united by shared desperation. Such coalitions tend to behave unpredictably. They might negotiate with one city while attacking another. They might offer mercenary service one season and raid the same employer the next. They might settle in one place only to be displaced again. From the perspective of established states, these erratic patterns would look like coordinated aggression. In reality, they may have been improvised responses to constantly shifting conditions. And this is where the boring but significant details of daily survival begin to shape the larger historical narrative. Grain shortages in one port could push 100 families onto boats. A blocked trade route in Anatolia could redirect displaced warriors toward coastal settlements. A regional drought could turn migrants into raiders when supplies ran out. Each of these individual decisions, mundane in isolation, contributed to the broader perception of a multi-ethnic wave of invaders sweeping across the Mediterranean. As the Sea Peoples moved, they likely relied on small but crucial strategies, building temporary alliances with other displaced groups, learning new coastal routes, adapting to unfamiliar agricultural landscapes, and exploiting gaps in local defenses. These strategies were not heroic or dramatic, they were pragmatic responses to scarcity, and yet, over time, they reshaped the political map of the region. Entire kingdoms disappeared while new societies began to form in the power vacuum they left behind. One of the most intriguing consequences of this period is the way it altered the demographic and cultural landscape of the Levant. In the decades after the Bronze Age collapse, new settlement patterns emerge across the region. Small agricultural villages, hilltop communities, and coastal port towns with mixed cultural influences. Some of these may be connected to groups traditionally labelled as Sea Peoples, such as the Peliset, who appear in the archaeological record of the southern Levant with distinctive pottery styles and architectural practices. Their presence suggests not only conquest but gradual adaptation and integration. This raises a broader question. Were the Sea Peoples truly destroyers, or were they catalysts of transformation? The evidence suggests they were both. They inflicted undeniable damage on many coastal cities, but they also became part of the emerging Iron Age world. In some cases, they may have contributed new technologies, new forms of warfare, and new patterns of agriculture. Their legacy is not that of a faceless horde, but of groups whose movements forced the Mediterranean system to reorganize itself. As we step back from the ruins of Ugarit, the abandoned palaces of Mycenae, and the charred ports along the Levant, we are confronted with a sobering realization. The Sea Peoples did not simply appear out of nowhere, nor did they act in a cultural vacuum. They were shaped by the same pressures that strained every kingdom around them. They were responding to the same environmental stresses, the same political tensions, and the same economic fragility. In a sense, they were an amplified reflection of the age's instability. And this leads us to a final question for this section, a question that invites deeper reflection before we continue. If the Sea Peoples emerged not from mystery but from the accumulated pressures of a collapsing world, then what exactly does their story reveal about how societies respond when the systems they rely on begin to fail? Before we continue deeper into the shifting tides of the Late Bronze Age, allow me a very brief moment to say something important. If you have somehow reached this point without subscribing to History in Ashes, please do so now. Truly please. Because much like the coastal cities that face the Sea Peoples, this channel is perilously exposed. Without your support, we may collapse faster than a grain silo in a drought-stricken Canaanite port, and unlike the Egyptians, we do not have Ramesses III to rescue us. So, if you are enjoying this journey through ancient chaos, consider clicking that subscribe button before we vanish from the map entirely. Now, returning to the story, we find ourselves at a crucial turning point. Up until now, we have examined the pressures that created the movements of the Sea Peoples. Administrative failures, environmental changes, shifting trade routes, and the slow erosion of political authority. But to truly understand the scale of the upheaval, we must now examine how the Mediterranean responded when these migrating groups began colliding with established powers at the height of their fragility. In the lands that once formed the northern edge of the Hittite Empire, the signs of disintegration were unmistakable. Villages, once tied to Hittite authority, began constructing simple defensive works, nothing elaborate, just quick fortifications made from earth and timber. These structures suggest that local populations no longer expected protection from the imperial center. Instead, they prepared to defend themselves against whoever might appear. Roaming groups of displaced peoples, neighboring rival communities, or even imperial tax collectors desperate for supplies. The Hittite kings responded by attempting to mobilize what remained of their administrative system, but even the most efficient bureaucracy cannot function without reliable communication. Clay tablets, found in the archives of Hattusa, reveal frantic letters from provincial governors begging for reinforcements, grain, or simply instructions. Many of these letters were never answered. Others were found still waiting to be sent, as though the scribes themselves were forced to abandon their work in mid-task. These small details, a half-written message, an unsealed tablet, an unfinished inventory, offer powerful glimpses into a world where routines that once seemed eternal were suddenly disrupted. And disruptions in routine, when multiplied across an entire empire, create a landscape where anything becomes possible, including the movement of large groups across territories that once seemed impenetrable. Meanwhile, across the Aegean, the Mycenaean world was experiencing its own unraveling. The collapse of palace economies meant that local elites no longer controlled the distribution of essential goods. Without that central coordination, communities turned inward. Farmers stored grain in private households rather than in palace magazines. Craftsmen produced goods on a smaller scale, and trade networks became increasingly localized. This decentralization, an ordinary, slow-moving process, had unexpected consequences. Without the palace elites to maintain international ties, Mycenaean courts could no longer coordinate diplomatic responses to foreign threats. When seaborne groups began appearing along the coasts of the Aegean, individual communities faced them alone. Some tried to resist, fortifying hilltops and valleys. Others fled inland. Still others may have joined the movements themselves, adding yet another layer of complexity to the groups that Egyptians would later describe collectively as the Sea Peoples. Nowhere is this fluidity more apparent than on Cyprus. By the late 13th century before the Common Era, Cyprus became a crossroads for displaced peoples, some seeking refuge, others seeking opportunity, and still others seeking dominance. The archaeological record reflects this convergence. Settlements destroyed and rebuilt multiple times, pottery styles mixing in unpredictable combinations, and coastal towns rearranged to accommodate both locals and newcomers. In the site of Kishan, for example, excavators uncovered layers showing repeated cycles of rebuilding, each with different construction techniques. This suggests new groups arrived, settled briefly, reorganized the urban layout according to their own needs, and were later displaced or assimilated. Such cycles would have created a sense of constant instability, forcing communities to adapt rapidly or face extinction. This unstable environment explains why the Sea People's presence is so difficult to classify. They were not a monolithic invader, nor a single migrating tribe, nor a uniform coalition. They were an ever-shifting collection of groups, warriors, traders, refugees, opportunists, farmers who formed temporary alliances, dissolved them, and reformed new ones as circumstances changed. These alliances were functional rather than ideological, driven by necessity rather than shared identity. When Egyptian scribes carved the names of these groups, Shurden, Peliset, Shekelesh, Danuna, Tieka, they were not identifying nations in the modern sense. They were recording situational alliances that, by the time they reached the Nile Delta, likely included people of varied origins. Each name represents a snapshot of a much larger and more fluid reality. As these groups moved steadily eastward, their interactions with local populations left material traces. In the southern Levant, villages expanded in some regions and contracted in others, suggesting that some communities successfully negotiated coexistence with newcomers while others did not. In the Judean foothills, new settlements appear with simple, uniform architecture, rectangular houses, storage silos, and agricultural terraces. These features contrast with earlier Canaanite styles, suggesting new inhabitants who reorganized the landscape according to their own survival strategies. These strategies were not heroic, they were practical. Simple architecture meant structures could be built quickly. Agricultural terraces maximized water use in a region with fluctuating rainfall. Uniform design made construction easier for communities with limited resources. None of these details feels dramatic or monumental, but collectively they reveal how people adjusted their lives to withstand instability. In many ways, these practical decisions shaped the emergence of early Iron Age societies more profoundly than any single battle. And yet, battles did come, especially in regions where the newcomers' movements threatened established powers. Egypt, under Ramesses III, faced the most coordinated wave of sea peoples, at least from the Egyptian perspective. The inscriptions at Medinet Habu depict both land and sea engagements with extraordinary detail. On the landward side, warriors with feathered helmets and round shields advance in tight formations. On the river or sea scenes, ships clash in chaotic encounters, with archers firing from high sterns and warriors attempting to board enemy vessels. These scenes are valuable, but they also compress complex events into singular moments of state propaganda. They emphasize Egyptian victory, Egyptian order, Egyptian resilience. They do not show the slow build-up of pressures that drove these groups southward, nor the desperation of families who loaded their possessions onto boats, nor the gradual dissolution of the world that had once sustained them. What is notable, however, is the way the Egyptians describe these groups. The texts emphasize that they came not merely as attackers, but as entire communities seeking new homelands. This suggests that by the time they reached the Nile, they were no longer acting as raiders but as resettling populations. Their ships carried more than weapons, they carried tools, livestock, and children. They were trying to survive. Egypt won its confrontation with the Sea Peoples, pushing them back from the delta and securing its borders for a time. But even this victory did not restore the old world. Trade networks remained broken. Vassal states remained weakened. The Hittite Empire disappeared entirely. The Mycenaean palaces never recovered. Cyprus reorganized into smaller, more independent communities, and new groups began to form identities that would define the Iron Age. The Sea Peoples, far from being an isolated historical curiosity, were part of a larger transformation, one in which the old world dissolved and a new one took shape through adaptation, improvisation, and resilience. And so, as we near the end of this section, we are left to ponder an often overlooked question. When populations on the move collide with fragile systems, Is the resulting upheaval truly caused by the newcomers? Or is it simply the moment when long-ignored weaknesses finally become impossible to hide? As we move deeper into the aftermath of Egypt's confrontation with the Sea Peoples, the Mediterranean landscape begins to resemble something fundamentally altered. The old networks that once bound distant kingdoms into a tight fabric of economic and diplomatic relationships had unraveled, leaving behind a patchwork of isolated regions learning to fend for themselves. If earlier sections of this story felt like watching a slow build toward collapse, this stage feels like studying the long, uneven process of adaptation that followed. And as always, the small, seemingly unimportant details carry the greatest weight. One of the most revealing places to study this transformation is along the Levantine coast, where the aftermath of upheaval created unusual conditions for new societies to form. Here, in the ruins of former Canaanite ports, foreign groups gradually established themselves, sometimes peacefully, sometimes through conflict. But the archaeological record rarely reflects a clean break between old and new. Instead, it shows layers of continuity intertwined with subtle shifts. In Ashkelon, excavations reveal a fascinating blend of cultural influences following the destruction layers associated with the end of the Late Bronze Age. Pottery styles change suddenly, but not completely. Older Canaanite shapes persist alongside newer forms, connected to groups often associated with the Sea Peoples. This suggests that the newcomers did not wipe out the local population, but rather settled among them, slowly reshaping daily life. Storage jars show new decorative patterns. Cooking pots shift in form, indicating changes in cuisine. Even the use of domestic space evolves, with household layouts reorganized to reflect different social practices. These domestic shifts might appear trivial, but they reflect deeper changes in identity. When people cook differently, store food differently, and arrange their homes differently, they reveal how cultural habits adapt to new realities. And in regions where displaced people settled, these changes occurred quickly but organically. Identity, in other words, was not imposed from above. It emerged from daily choices: how to raise children, how to trade goods, how to structure community boundaries. Further inland, particularly in the southern Levantine highlands, new settlements emerged that had no obvious predecessors. These were small, often unwalled farm communities with simple architecture. The houses typically followed a three-room plan: long corridors for storage and work, central courtyards, and modest sleeping spaces. This uniformity suggests a population with limited resources, relying on practical construction techniques that could be implemented with minimal labor. These communities focused heavily on agriculture. Terraces were built on hillsides to trap soil and moisture. Small silos were constructed near homes to protect grain. Sheep and goats grazed in nearby slopes. Such infrastructure may seem mundane, but it represents deliberate adaptation to a harsh and unpredictable environment, and it shows how populations displaced by the wider collapse carved out new livelihoods far from the chaos of coastal conflict. The emergence of these highland settlements is one of the clearest examples of how the collapse set the stage for new societies. These modest villages eventually became the foundation for Iron Age polities, including those that later appear in the historical record under names like Israel and Judah. Their development was not dramatic. There were no sudden conquests or grand founding moments. Instead, they grew slowly, shaped by agricultural routines, seasonal rhythms, and the need to secure food, an unremarkable but deeply significant process. While the highlands adapted in relative isolation, the coastal regions saw more dramatic interactions. The group, later known as the Philistines, often associated with one of the Sea Peoples, the Peliset established several major cities: Ashdod, Ekron, Gath, Gaza, and Ashkelon. What makes their presence particularly intriguing is the clear evidence of cultural blending in the first generations of settlement. Early Philistine pottery, for instance, shows strong Aegean influences, with shapes and decorations reminiscent of Mycenaean styles. But within a few decades, these forms shift again, incorporating local Canaanite motifs and techniques. This blending suggests not only adaptation but active exchange. The newcomers adopted local practices, where useful, and maintained older traditions where meaningful. Over time, entirely new styles emerged, neither fully imported nor fully native. This blending, is evident in other aspects of life as well. Diet studies, based on animal bones excavated from Philistine sites, reveal that pork consumption was initially high, consistent with Aegean dietary habits, but declined over time as local practices became dominant. Domestic architecture at early Philistine sites also reflects transitional forms, with some houses built in Aegean-inspired layouts and others adopting local Canaanite designs. These details offer a more grounded view of the Sea Peoples. They were not simply destroyers or raiders. They were people navigating unfamiliar landscapes, negotiating with established communities, and gradually creating new cultural identities. They built cities, planted crops, raised families, and adapted to the increasingly fragmented world around them. Beyond the Levant, shifting settlement patterns appear across the Mediterranean. In Sardinia, for instance, the Nuragic civilization began constructing more intricate and fortified settlements during this period. Some scholars suggest that interactions with groups resembling the Shurden, another group named in Egyptian records, may have influenced local society. Whether the Shurden originated in Sardinia or migrated there later remains debated. But the archaeological record does indicate increased coastal defenses, suggesting heightened regional competition or fear of seaborne groups. In Sicily, too, coastal settlements show signs of new population movements, with pottery styles suggesting links to both the Aegean and the central Mediterranean. These shifts hint at broader ripple effects from the upheavals farther east. Displaced peoples did not move in one direction but dispersed across the sea, creating pockets of cultural fusion wherever they settled. Meanwhile, in Anatolia, the collapse of the Hittite Empire gave rise to what historians call the Syro-Anatolian principalities, small, independent polities formed from the remnants of the imperial system. These principalities, such as Carchemish and Melid, maintained elements of Hittite culture while developing new political structures to survive in the post-collapse world. They engaged in trade, rebuilt local economies, and navigated a landscape where no single power dominated. This diversification of political authority is one of the most striking legacies of the collapse. Instead of a few large empires controlling vast territories, the Eastern Mediterranean became a mosaic of small states, each adapting to local conditions. This decentralization allowed cultural experimentation, new forms of governance, and novel economic strategies. But it also created opportunities and dangers for groups on the move. The Sea Peoples, or their descendants, interacted with these new states in various ways. Sometimes they integrated as mercenaries, offering military expertise in exchange for land or provisions. Other times they competed for resources, particularly along contested coastal zones. In a few cases, they may have become political actors themselves, forming new local dynasties or merging with existing populations to shape regional identity. All these developments reflect a world that did not simply collapse, but reorganized itself. And that reorganization was driven not by kings or generals, but by countless ordinary decisions made by people adapting to new realities. Which crops to plant, where to build homes, whom to marry, when to migrate, how to defend against threats. History often highlights battles and treaties, but in this period, it was the quiet resilience of daily life that determined the future. Even Egypt, the last great Bronze Age power to survive the collapse, entered a period of gradual decline. Although Ramesses III repelled the Sea Peoples, the strains of constant warfare, economic disruptions, and internal challenges weakened the state. Temples received fewer offerings, bureaucrats complained of missed rations. Labor strikes, remarkably well documented, reflect frustration among workers who relied on the state for food. These small cracks widened over time, and Egypt's authority diminished, leaving it less capable of shaping events beyond its borders. By the time the Iron Age began in full, the Mediterranean was a different world. Old powers faded, new societies emerged, trade routes reformed along new paths, technologies shifted, languages diversified. The Sea Peoples once feared, once blamed for the collapse, became part of the fabric of the new age, not as destroyers, but as participants in rebuilding. And so this section leaves us with a question that historians continue to debate. If the Sea Peoples became woven into the very societies that emerged from the collapse, should we remember them primarily as invaders, or as one of the many forces that helped shape a new Mediterranean world out of the ruins of the old? The slow unraveling of kingdoms along the eastern Mediterranean coast can look, at a distance, like a series of sudden collapses, but when examined closely, it feels more like watching the seams of an old garment being tugged, pulled, and quietly frayed. The lands that once held firm under the weight of powerful monarchs and careful bureaucrats were now struggling to maintain the delicate balance between food, trade, and political authority. What had once been normal shipments of grain arriving in predictable cycles, messengers hurrying from port towns with lists of expected cargo, artisans hammering bronze in open courtyards, now felt uncertain. Entire regions that had depended on maritime trade suddenly found themselves separated from their lifelines. And in that uncertainty, fear spread faster than any army. By this time, cities like Ugarit, which once hummed with administrative activity, found themselves caught between distant orders and approaching danger. Clay tablets buried beneath layers of ash show a kind of panic rarely preserved in official correspondence. One ruler pleaded for assistance, explaining that hostile ships had been sighted offshore, described in terms that made them sound both familiar and utterly foreign. The messengers who carried these tablets likely moved with a sense of urgency, not knowing if the people they sought to warn were still alive. Further south, the Egyptians were pushing themselves through the slow mechanical process of state survival. Their scribes continued to catalogue grain, maintain temple accounts, and record the movements of soldiers, even as the outside world shifted like sand underfoot. They seemed to understand perhaps better than their neighbours that the threat approaching from the sea was no ordinary disruption. These were not seasonal raiders or disorganized pirates. These were groups who moved with families, livestock, and tools. They were, in every sense, migrants on the move, and yet they arrived with the ability to destroy. The Egyptians had already encountered these seaborne peoples in earlier centuries, but now the scale was different. Entire confederations were on the move, blending refugees, displaced farmers, and aggressive warbands into a force that defied easy classification. Some came seeking land, some came seeking food, others came because the places they once called home no longer existed. This blurring of categories, invader, migrant, conqueror, survivor, made it difficult for the kingdoms of the region to anticipate their intentions. What they did know was that these newcomers traveled in numbers large enough to overwhelm even fortified cities. The Egyptians, with their long administrative memory, understood that survival required absorbing information as quickly as they could collect it. Scouts were dispatched along river routes. Naval contingents patrolled delta waterways. Messages spread from garrison to garrison, instructing commanders to prepare defensive positions. This was a world where calm bureaucratic procedure met the anxious edge of war. At the same time, the sea peoples themselves were undergoing transformations, often overlooked in the dramatic retellings of this era. They were not a single people, nor did they speak a single language. They were, instead, a patchwork of tribes and clans, some from regions near the Aegean, others from areas further west or north, and still others whose origins remain debated. They travelled with children who clung to the sides of wagons, with older members who walked slowly behind the younger warriors, and with animals that needed constant care. They moved with the rhythms of necessity. If there was no water, they marched until water was found. If a settlement resisted, they used force. If a port offered negotiation, they paused to listen. And in the middle of this delicate and dangerous landscape, smaller communities along the Levantine coast faced choices that must have weighed heavily on their leaders. Some attempted negotiation, others chose resistance. Many simply fled inland, hoping that distance and geography would serve as their shield. A fisherman who had once spent dawn preparing nets might now spend those hours watching the horizon, unsure whether the distant shapes were merchant sails or something far more dangerous. A scribe, who once wrote routine tax notes, might now be instructed to list evacuation routes or inventory emergency grain reserves. These subtle changes, unremarkable on their own, were the threads that, when woven together, reveal the scale of the crisis. As seasons passed, the increasing movement of displaced peoples created a strange mixture of tension and opportunity. In certain inland regions, farmers found that abandoned tools, land, or livestock from fleeing neighbours could be used to support their own families. In port cities, however, the opposite was true. The more people arrived seeking refuge, the faster food supplies dwindled. Grain that once lasted a year might now be consumed in half that time. Bakers who once opened their shops each morning might now stand before empty storerooms, hoping for a shipment that would never come. Meanwhile, the Egyptian high command continued to gather reports. They knew that battles had been fought further north and that some important cities had fallen. They knew that once secure vassal states were now sending erratic messages, some pleading for military aid, others falling silent altogether. They also knew that rivers and coastlines offered little protection against a determined group of migrants who could adapt quickly to changing circumstances. What makes this period striking is how many of the surviving records depict the Sea Peoples not only as fighters, but as people traveling with their households. This is not the imagery of swift raiding crews. This is the imagery of entire societies uprooted. If their ships carried warriors, they also carried the tools of settlement: grinding stones, pottery, weaving instruments, even livestock. It suggests that for many, the goal was not merely plunder, but transformation to carve out a new place in a world that had become unstable. Egyptian administrators, sensitive to the patterns of population movement, attempted to identify which groups posed direct military threats and which groups might be settled on Egyptian terms. This distinction mattered. A group willing to accept Egyptian oversight could be settled as a buffer population, becoming both a resource and a defensive layer. A group seeking independence, however, might threaten the delicate agricultural balance necessary to feed the Nile Valley. Decisions taken in these moments, some carefully considered, others made under immediate pressure, would shape the demographics of future regions. The Sea Peoples themselves, moving along the coastline, must have encountered landscapes scarred by earlier conflicts. Charred remains of farmhouses along trade roads, empty docks where merchants once traded timber for metals, fields left unplanted because the farmers had either died or fled. All of this would have reinforced the urgency, pushing them onward. Survival required constant motion. It required searching for stable ground in a world that offered very little. Among the most interesting details preserved in archaeological layers is the evidence of makeshift repairs, pottery patched with unfamiliar techniques, tools reshaped from damaged bronze, shelters constructed from salvaged timbers. These subtle traces reflect moments of adaptation that rarely appear in grand narratives of invasion. A family repairing a pot is not the image that usually comes to mind when discussing the collapse of empires, but these moments matter. They show people attempting to maintain a sense of normal life, even when surrounded by uncertainty. As the Egyptian defenses tightened, and as word spread that the Nile Delta was preparing for conflict, the Sea Peoples' confederations faced difficult decisions. Some may have chosen to bypass Egypt entirely. Others saw confrontation as unavoidable. The Delta, with its branching waterways and shifting marshlands, offered both opportunity and danger. For any group hoping to settle there, the land promised agricultural richness. But it also promised entanglement with one of the most organized states of the era. Egypt's leadership, aware that a decisive battle might shape the future of their kingdom for generations, began to prepare in earnest. Commanders studied the terrain, identifying which channels could be blocked and which positions could serve as fortified lines. Scribes recorded the movement of supplies. Farmers along the delta edges were instructed to store surplus grain. The calm, methodical machinery of the Egyptian state continued to operate, even as tension grew. By the time the Sea Peoples reached the Delta front, both sides were aware that the confrontation would not be a brief clash, but a significant test of endurance. For the Egyptians, the question was whether their organization could withstand the pressure of so many displaced groups arriving at once. For the Sea Peoples, the question was whether they could secure a future in a region that was already stretched thin. And so the stage was set, a slow collision between a state fighting to preserve its administrative order and a collection of wandering peoples trying to build a life in the shadow of collapsing systems. The quiet struggles of farmers, scribes, merchants, and families all converged into this moment, a meeting shaped as much by necessity as by ambition. What happens when a migrating population seeking stability meets a powerful kingdom fighting to maintain its own balance? By the time the Sea Peoples engaged the Egyptian forces in the Nile Delta, The Mediterranean world had already been transformed almost beyond recognition. Decades of disrupted trade, failed harvests, shifting alliances, and the collapse of once mighty kingdoms had created a landscape where small decisions carried monumental consequences. The old networks that had connected Anatolia, the Levant, Cyprus, and the Aegean had fragmented into local corridors, some abandoned, others fiercely contested. Cities that had once depended on distant rulers now relied on their own resources and local leadership. In this environment, even a relatively small migrating population could have an outsized impact on the balance of power. Egyptian reliefs at Medinet Habu famously depict the confrontation. Ships jammed with warriors, archers firing from the stern, soldiers wading through marshes, the chaos of battle frozen in stone. Yet these images compress years of movements, migrations, and minor skirmishes into a single narrative of Egyptian victory. The reality was far messier. The Sea Peoples had not appeared overnight. They were the culmination of decades of gradual pressure, a mixture of displaced farmers, artisans, and warriors responding to environmental stress, collapsing economies, and political fragmentation. Their movements were both desperate and deliberate. The battle itself, while historically significant, was only one moment in a much larger transformation. Even after Ramesses III repelled the invaders, the structural weaknesses that had allowed the Sea Peoples to move through the Mediterranean persisted. Inland, city-states struggled with reduced trade and fewer resources. In the Aegean, Mycenaean palaces lay in ruins, their bureaucracies abandoned. Cyprus reorganized into smaller settlements with shifting cultural influences. And in the Levant, the Philistine cities gradually took shape, blending Aegean, Canaanite, and local traditions into a new cultural identity. These post-conflict years highlight one of the most important lessons of the Sea People's story. Survival is rarely about the immediate outcome of a single battle. It is about adaptation to long-term systemic changes. Families uprooted by coastal destruction established new settlements in the highlands. Communities displaced by raids or environmental stress rebuilt using whatever materials and techniques were available, often blending older practices with new ones. Trade routes were reoriented, political alliances reconsidered, and social customs slowly evolved. These adjustments, though unremarkable on a day-to-day level, determined which societies endured and which faded from memory. Archaeological evidence provides remarkable insight into these transformations. In Philistine settlements, for instance, the earliest layers show strong Aegean influences in pottery and architecture. Over time, however, these features merge with local Canaanite traditions. Houses shift from two-room to three-room layouts. Cooking methods change. Dietary patterns evolve. These incremental modifications reflect a slow process of cultural assimilation and survival. The Sea Peoples were no longer only outsiders, they were co-creators of a new Mediterranean world. Inland, settlements that had avoided direct conflict flourished in unexpected ways. Villages in the Judean hills show signs of careful agricultural planning, terracing to retain soil, silos to store grain, and modest homes that could be expanded over generations. These communities reveal a pragmatic approach to survival, minimal architectural ambition, maximum attention to sustainability. They provide a counterpoint to the grand narratives of collapse, emphasizing that life continued, often quietly, in the shadow of disrupted kingdoms. Meanwhile, in Anatolia, former Hittite territories became fragmented into Syro-Anatolian principalities, each small state experimenting with governance, diplomacy, and trade in isolation. Some, like Carchemish, maintained elements of Hittite administrative culture. Others adopted more flexible arrangements suited to their local environment. Together, these principalities formed a patchwork that would define the early Iron Age political landscape, offering stability in an otherwise uncertain world. The Sea Peoples' influence extended even beyond immediate settlements. Their migration helped accelerate the transition from the Bronze Age to the Iron Age. Displaced artisans and warriors brought knowledge, techniques, and innovations that blended with local traditions. Ironworking technology, once specialized, began to spread more widely across the Mediterranean. Warfare tactics adapted to new realities, reflecting lessons learned in both conflict and survival. In this sense, the Sea Peoples were not only catalysts for destruction but also vectors for transformation. Egypt itself, while victorious, faced long-term consequences. The treasury had been strained by the campaigns. The agricultural base along the Nile required careful management, and labor unrest documented in temple records shows that societal pressures had not disappeared. Even a powerful state like Egypt was forced to adapt, learning that a single military victory could not reverse decades of regional instability. Their story reinforces the larger pattern. Survival during this period depended on flexibility, strategic adaptation, and the ability to endure ongoing systemic change. Over the following centuries, the Mediterranean world settled into a new configuration. Philistine cities became centers of commerce and cultural exchange. Highland villages in the Levant gave rise to emerging societies that would later enter historical records. Cyprus, Sardinia, and parts of Anatolia established smaller, more resilient communities. Even the memory of the Mycenaean palaces persisted in oral traditions and scattered material culture, influencing subsequent Greek development. The movements of the Sea Peoples had reshaped the political and cultural map, not through annihilation alone, but through integration, adaptation, and the long, quiet process of survival. The final lesson of this era is not one of drama or spectacle. It is about persistence, resilience, and the subtle forces that shape history over decades. The Sea Peoples, often portrayed as mysterious invaders, were simultaneously destroyers and builders, catalysts of collapse and instruments of creation. They navigated a collapsing world, made choices to survive, and in doing so, contributed to the birth of a new Mediterranean order. Their legacy is not found only in battles or inscriptions, but in the material traces of daily life. Repaired pottery, repurposed buildings, adapted tools, and hybridized cultural practices. And so, as we look back across the eastern Mediterranean, from the burned palaces of Ugarit to the reconstructed harbors of the Philistines, from the reorganized villages in the highlands to the surviving bureaucracies of Egypt, we are left with a lingering question that defines the era. When a world collapses, not all at once, but in slow, uneven stages, how do we determine the line between destruction and creation, between invaders and survivors, and between the end of one age and the beginning of another? The story of the Sea Peoples reminds us that history is rarely neat. It is a complex web of movement, adaptation, and resilience, and within that web, even the unknown, the marginalized, and the displaced leave indelible marks that shape the centuries to come.